Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sierra Lamonaco, and I am the Alumni Relations Officer with the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. And once again, we'll be filling in for Sonia as one of the MCs for today's Lunch and Learn event. Now, I hope each and every one of you had a wonderful start to the week, and it sounds like everyone did, and are excited for today's very special presentation. So I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us here today. After reviewing the registration list and after asking everyone, which by the way is my favorite thing to ask, it's lovely to see so many people joining us from all around the world. And just so you know, we actually have people joining us from 7 different countries. We had Bahamas, obviously our Canada crew, England, Hong Kong, Italy, Serbia, and even the United States. Now, for those who are new to the Lunch and Learn, I don't know if you know this, but Lunch and Learn was actually founded in 1935. So that's about 87 years ago. And during that time, it was really tough for the students to find jobs after they graduated. So alas, the group was like, you know what, let's meet up. Let's meet up monthly. And so they did at Fran's Restaurant on College Street. And well, the rest was history. Now, before we begin today's presentation, I want to acknowledge this land in which the university operates on. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. Now, a quick housekeeping item. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for a formal Q&A session. Should you have any questions for our wonderful guest speakers, Professor Robert Andrews and Professor Susan Andrews, please submit the questions in the Q&A button below at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And for the individuals who actually submitted the questions during the registration period, thank you. And I know I mentioned this last time, but thank you for pursuing your curiosities and once again, sharing those insightful questions. We actually shared your questions before with Professor Robert Andrews and Susan Andrews, so they were aware of the questions before the presentation, and we will continue to share them throughout today's presentation. Now, without further ado, it brings me tremendous honor and pleasure to introduce the one and only, my partner in crime, our magnificent MC and our charismatic chair of the School Lunch and Learn program, Lori Hevola. Lori is not only a U of T graduate my apologies, a U of T graduate, but he's also an electrical graduate 65. He's also one of our most dedicated, passionate, and engaged members of the School Lunch and Learn and alumni community. So he's been chairing the School Lunch and Learn program for numerous years now and continuously generously donates his time to helping us maintain the School Lunch and Learn long established traditions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lori Hevola, who will now introduce our guest speakers for today's event. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Sierra, for your very warm introduction and your partner in crime. It is my pleasure to welcome our 2 guest speakers, Professor Robert Andrews and Professor Susan Andrews. Today, they will be discussing the health impacts of microplastics in drinking water. There's been a lot of interest in this subject from the questions submitted in advance. Professor Robert Andrews has over 25 years of experience in the field of drinking water treatment, both as an academic researcher as well as a consultant. He holds a Natural Science and Engineering Research Council Senior Industrial Chair in Drinking Water Research here at the University of Toronto in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering. He regularly collaborates with researchers across Canada, in the United States, and internationally regarding current and emerging drinking water related issues. Professor Susan Andrews has been investigating various aspects of drinking water and its sources for more than 25 years as well, and has been with the Drinking Water Research Group since 2008. Her research specialty is in the area of identifying and minimizing chemical byproducts from water treatment, involving projects that span the globe and include participants from non-engineering fields. She has made significant contributions to professional and government organizations related to water, such as the chair of the Ontario Waterworks Association, director of the Walkerton Clean Water Centre, and program leader for the Canadian Water Network. And currently she serves as a member of the Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Andrews and Professor Susan Andrews.
Thanks, Laurie. It's really a pleasure for us to be with you today and talk about this very emerging and interesting topic. I also want to thank everybody for sending their questions in ahead of time, because that's given us the opportunity to perhaps tailor the presentation a bit to answer some of those questions as we go through things. Today, we've entitled the presentation, Microplastics in Drinking Water, Why the Concern? And this is a question that we're asked very frequently, and hopefully at the end of this presentation, you will feel empowered that if somebody asks you, should I be concerned about microplastics in drinking water, you will be able to answer them. So we'll see as we go through. What I'm going to do is, since people are from a very wide background today, I'm going to give you some general information about microplastics in the environment. And I'm going to show examples of some of the great work that we've been doing very recently at the University of Toronto. So it's going to be kind of a combination. Anyway, without further ado, why don't we get underway? This is a picture from Life magazine in the 1950s celebrating plastic. I think this is one of the first big times when plastics enter our lives, and who knew, all these years later that we would be speaking about them in a slightly different tone. If you wonder where all these great things come from, they initially start as plastic pellets. There are different types of polymers, different colors, and what they're done is used actually to make molds of many of the things that you have around your desk or your house, or even the glasses that I'm wearing today. What we can do is we can combine different types to change colors, to change the characteristics of the plastic. And then ultimately, these come in the form of your computer keyboard and many other things that we all have in our households. Unfortunately, they can also result or end up in our lakes and rivers, where they can further degrade from these big pieces into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces that can then become problematic. Let's just take a look at this from a quick global perspective. Microplastics are something that's present everywhere in the globe. From the Arctic to the Pacific, the Atlantic, you cannot find hardly a spot on Earth that hasn't been impacted. Many of you may have heard of the Great Garbage Patch that's off the coast of the United States, somewhere between San Francisco and Hawaii. And if you think about that, most people will think that they're going to see something like this. And we call these macroplastics, anything bigger than about 5 millimeters. But in fact, you see very little of these on the surface. And one of my colleagues, Professor Rockman from evolutionary biology at U of T, has actually been there and looked at it below the surface. And what she's told me is it looks almost like a cloud or a fog. And these are the breakdown products of these plastic materials. It's interesting too to see how the world thinks about these. And society. And just looking at this, article from the Toronto Star from last year, they're suggesting that United Nations recently has declared that plastics are the second most ominous threat to the global environment following climate change. So, this is a big deal. We can likely all relate to finding small bits of plastic on beaches, as this person is holding in their hands here. So let's talk about some basic information that we're going to need to have readily available to appreciate, what I'm going to be speaking about today. We talk about primary and secondary plastics. Primary may be that your keyboard or your mouse or things that are on your desk. Secondary are when these break down into smaller and smaller bits. What are the categories? Well, when they enter this microplastic range, size range, we can refer to them as fragments, as fibers, spheres. In fact, spheres were used in up to a few years ago in cleaning products. And in fact, on some you'd see even enhanced with microspheres to help them as in skin cleansers and other things. We also refer to them as pellets or films. For example, the transparent film that you use for covering things in a refrigerator. And here's just a couple of examples. These are just from some of the microscopic images from our labs. Here just shows a fiber and a fragment. We have many different polymer types or types of plastics: polypropylene, polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, polyethyl tertiary, polystyrene, polycarbonate, and many, many more. Also, it's not just the polymer itself. Manufacturers will add things like UV stabilizers, flame retardants, things to make the plastics more flexible. So there's a lot of other chemical compounds that are added to these materials. Sizes. These range from anywhere from about a millimeter down to submicron sizes, and I'll be getting into those a little bit later. Okay, now everybody has a good background. When you think about plastics in water, I hope that people are not thinking that it's something like this person is pouring into this glass. This is certainly not what we're seeing. So I want you to think about this image and then quickly forget about it. So now getting into some of the questions that people commonly ask is, well, how many microplastics are in our water? Let's maybe start with bottled water. It's being studied fairly extensively, and we know it to contain some of the highest level of microplastics. So if people think, well, I'm not going to drink tap water, I'm going to get bottled water, I can tell you that there are orders of magnitude more microplastics in bottled water than tap water. If we look at, finished waters, treated waters that may be coming out of the tap, we're seeing maybe, a few tens of particles per liter. At least that's what we've seen from our research. So much, much lower than you would find in bottled water. Okay, a few definitions, and I have to thank the California State Water Resources Control Board for coming up with these. They're going to be one of the first to require monitoring of microplastics in North America. And just last year, they came up with a definition that we could all relate to. They're solid polymeric materials. They may contain, and in most cases do contain, chemical additives or other substances. They have at least 3 dimensions, and they're greater than a nanometer and less than 5 millimeters or 5,000 microns. And most of the ones in drinking water we're dealing with are in the scale of about 1 micron to maybe about 20 or 40 microns. Here's just an example if you were to put some of these on your finger, and I can tell you most of them that we think about in drinking water are much smaller than can be seen with the naked eye. So these would be the larger end of what would be represented. Okay, let's start on why the concern. So without trying to dwell on, what are the numbers are in drinking water, and I'll get to that again a little later, but why should we be concerned about these? Well, first of all, we know they're ubiquitous in surface waters and lakes and rivers throughout Canada, North America, as well as globally. We know that they're removed to some extent during drinking water treatment and water reuse. However, we have a very poor understanding of this at this time. Microplastics have literally only been studied for the past couple of years. Health risks, well, they're not well defined either. There's been a lot of work done on using larger particles, feeding these to fish and other animals, but the ones that are smaller than about 20 microns, there hasn't been a lot of work with these. So, potential health effects. The World Health Organization came up with a list of their top 3. And these I have personally coined as the triple threat. So that's just my label that I put on these. First is that they're small physical particles that can enter the body and actually move around. Second, they have chemicals associated with them. Not only the chemicals that were in their manufacture that can leach, but also when they're floating around for months or years in lakes and river, they can absorb and concentrate chemicals that may be of concern to us. Thirdly, over time, they will develop a biofilm on the plastic surface. And these can unfortunately include potential pathogenic organisms. Okay, when we talk about physical characteristics, typically in drinking water, we're referring to microplastics less than about 120 microns. And the ones that we worry about are the small end from about 1 to 20 microns, because they can translocate through the body into different systems. And they've been observed even as far as 20 years ago to be present in mammalian liver, kidneys, and also gut. Now, in terms of drinking water, there hasn't been a lot of focus. Some focus in European countries, but not much at all in North America. There's also been not a lot of attempts to try and impact the impacts of different polymer types, whether it's polycarbonate, polyvinyl chloride. It's just been known that there are particles present. Also, when these are in the environment, they will weather, they will degrade. And what's the impact of that in terms of their ultimate toxicology? A lot of studies have been conducted using brand new plastics that we can purchase, as opposed to trying to use aged ones that we would find in the environment. So let's talk about this translocation. And this is just a very simplistic picture that when microplastics are ingested by fish, we know that they can actually remain and congregate in different organs. This is just a picture of a fluorescent particle actually in a mussel. So clams, mussels, which are filter feeders, filter large volumes of water, and it's no surprise that they're filtering out microplastics. As well, if we look at things like mice, and actually if we have fed mice different sizes of plastics, we can see that they're apparent in liver, kidneys, the gut, and other portions of the body. So now you're kind of getting aware of why we maybe should be concerned about these, but we still do not know the exact toxicological impacts. So I talked about them, the physical characteristics. They're small. Because they're small, they can get into the body and translocate around the body. I also commented that they have chemicals associated with them. So we often refer to them as a chemical delivery system or a chemical vector. This may not be the chemicals that were included when they were manufactured, but also ones that they can adsorb as they've been present for lakes and rivers for weeks, if not months or years. So we see something like this occurring where these chemicals can attach to the plastic particles. These can be particles that maybe are fairly young in age. Maybe they've only been there for a few months, or ones that have been there and weathered to a large degree. So their surfaces are rougher. And we know from some of our studies that the rougher the surface, the more they can absorb. So some of the concerns are the toxicity associated with the polymer composition, as well as the substances that are absorbed from our lakes and rivers and concentrated. So that's why we call these potential vectors for the transport of chemicals. And one such group of chemicals are referred to as polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And this is one group that we decided to do a bit of work on at the University of Toronto. So what we were looking at is how well could these compounds adsorb onto polyethylene. And this was done by a master's student in our lab, where we spiked a known amount of this compound into water, had some polyethylene microspheres present, and then we looked at how much was absorbed. And that's why we see this decrease in concentration from the liquid, because it was now being absorbed by the particles. And we decided to use a couple different particle sizes. And what we were looking to see is how long would it take to uptake these chemicals, how long to reach equilibrium, we'll call it. And then, are there any differences in terms of the smaller particles and the larger? Well, we know the smaller particles can absorb more at a faster rate. Again, not looking good for the small particles. So we looked at two compounds that would be classified as polyaromatic hydrocarbons. This was the first. The second, fluoranthene, you can see similar results. Here it took a little longer to reach this equilibrium. But again, what you can see from this is that the type of compound you're trying to absorb does impact how long it will take to be absorbed. If the size decreases, per unit mass, the surface area will decrease, and their ability to absorb will also increase. Again, smaller particles, not so good. We also noted when we used weathered polyethylene as opposed to brand new polyethylene, that weathering would increase absorption. So we're starting to know and understand this now a bit better. And we've actually just submitted a paper, this was last month, that hopefully will be published in the next couple months with respect to these compounds, adsorption onto one type of polymer in fresh waters. So just to give you a bit of insight on some of the other work that we're currently doing regarding microplastics as chemical vectors, what we're looking at is sorption of 250, we call this non-targeted organic pollutants. If we look in any river or lake, we're going to find literally hundreds of things that have been discharged. We want to know how many of those are absorbed into what different types of polymers or plastics. We're also looking specifically at compounds. We've looked at the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and we're also looking at flame retardants. You may have seen these in the news, called PFOAs or PFOS, known to be particularly toxic. And we want to just see if these are being concentrated on different types of plastics. We're also looking at leaching of plastic additives. So how much of the things that are added to make them more flame retardant or more UV resistant are actually going to leach out in water. And we're looking at many different types of polymers, and then we're exposing what we extract from them to different types of mammalian cells to see if there's a reaction in cells. The third part of this puzzle, as I introduced, the third of the triple threats, was microplastics as microbiological vectors or microbiological transport systems. So over time, the microplastics will develop a biofilm on them in lakes and rivers. Actually, our treatment plants do a pretty good job of removing these. The only question is, what if we don't remove 100% and some of these are now present in our drinking water? Should we be concerned that these microplastics can harbor pathogens? Well, we know that microplastics are not going away anytime soon. If anything, we're seeing increasing concentrations over the years. And even if we were to stop using plastic altogether, it's going to take decades for all of these to settle out or degrade. So we know we're going to have them for a while. So we need to say, okay, let's take a look at them in terms of pathogens. So we know that biofilm can carry things like, you've probably heard of E. coli or Pseudomonas. They can also be a sink for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And as well, any particle can resist disinfection when we add, say, chlorine to drinking water. Also, we know that the biofilm itself will serve to absorb more chemicals than just the plastic on its own. So it kind of magnifies things. So how have previous studies up to date, been limited? Well, first of things, they haven't looked at drinking waters. Much of the work in the world in terms of microplastics has been done in oceans or saline waters. So we want to focus this more on fresh waters. One of the things that we've done is looked at the growth of biofilm on 4 plastics. We've looked at different types of, 4 different source waters looking at different plastics. We measured by biofilm using a compound we call ATP or adenosine triphosphate, which just is a surrogate to represent the growth of cells. What we've done is expose different types of plastics to lake and river waters over a period of time ranging from weeks up to a few months, and looked at biofilm growth on different types of plastics. And when we compare these, what we found is that PVC actually stood out in being able to support more growth than some of the other common plastics that we experience. So we thought, okay, that's interesting, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper. So what we did is we extracted the microorganisms that were present on the plastics, sent them to another University Toronto lab that specializes in metagenomics, because we certainly aren't experts at everything, and it's great to have this wide scope of talent at the University of Toronto. So don't worry that I'm going to get into this in a lot of depth. I'm going to give you the highlights. What we looked at is 4 different water sources, 2 rivers and 2 lakes in Ontario. And then we looked at 5 different types of plastics. And what I want you to note from here is we looked at brand new plastics and those that had been weathered for a few months. And what we found is that there was always an increase of growth of different types of bacteria, more so on the weathered plastic. And we assume this because there's a lot more surface area. What we also found is that of the different bacteria that we analyzed, we found some can contain Salmonella, some E. coli, and these are things that we would rather not ingest. Like I've said before, drinking water treatment is very good at removing these particles and also disinfecting them if need be, but it's not a topic that we have looked at in detail before. We also looked at the growth in a different way. This is a very fancy way called principal coordinated analysis. And all this shows is that there were a higher amount of pathogens associated with PVC. So this is interesting stuff. This is moving the science forward And this again, we have recently submitted for publication. Okay, now you've got some really good knowledge that when we come back to looking at microplastics in drinking water, you can actually see some of the holes in the previous data that's been published. And I just want to point out a few. There's literally only been a handful of studies of looking at microplastics in fresh water in the world. Most of these I've summarized here, as well as I haven't added work that was done by our lab. But here you can see in raw waters, they're ranging from 1 in 1,000 liters to 6,000 in 1 liter. In treated waters, you're seeing a large decrease, which is always good. But these were called treated waters, not tap waters. And also they were done by different people, different researchers in different labs. So one researcher actually looked at 3 different water treatment plants and looked at what was in the raw water and in the treated water. And they found higher concentrations than those by others. Then let's look at 2 studies that just looked at tap water alone. And here you can see that the concentrations are on the lower end, kind of being, between 1 and 5. So you're probably saying, well, how can these vary? Well, they could vary by the water source, but it's probably how they were analyzed. Let's look over at this column. Some people look down to 1 micron size, where others look down to 60 microns. And what we've found is that the smaller and smaller you go, the more and more particles that there are likely to exist. So that's why when you see these ones that measure down to 1 micron, they're a lot more accurate than the ones that didn't. But these are just some of the things that are being elucidated in the data that we're currently working on now. And all of our studies go down at least to 1 micron. So typically we have many more small size particles. And a lot of questions come up when you're trying to compare data by different labs, by different authors. And we're actually trying to generate some standard sizes of different types of particles that can be used by other researchers so that we can better compare our data. Some people may ask, well, these seem to be about the size of things that, we've been concerned about in water treatment for many years. And we can say, yes, Giardia is one of the protozoa that we look to remove in drinking water treatment. And that's about the approximate size of a fragment. Similarly, Cryptosporidium may be about the size of a microsphere. Things like E. coli, similar to the size of a fiber, and rotavirus, similar to the size of a nanosphere. So we know that we're able to effectively remove Giardia and Crypto, and we can kill using disinfection, E. coli or rotavirus. So we would anticipate that water treatment should be effective to remove microplastics. However, we have to remember microplastics have much different surface characteristics. You can't kill them like you can E. coli or rotavirus. So we need to do further work on that, and we have. I'll show you some of the work that we've done in Ontario in terms of looking at microplastic removal through different stages of drinking water treatment. So we have the raw water, then we settle things out, then we put it through a filter, then we disinfect the water. And one of the things that we monitor is the water quality. So the turbidity, or how many particles in the water, decreases during treatment. And that's good, but these are typically much larger particles that we're observing than the very small microplastics. So let's look at some real results. And this is what we've done in our lab from one of the treatment facilities in Ontario. So these are pie charts that show all of the anthropogenic or man-made compounds that we found in terms of particles. So what I'm going to do is eliminate the ones that aren't classified as microplastics and just focus on the plastics. So you can see this little piece of the pie and the colors associated with different plastic types. Now what I'm going to show you is the actual numbers. So here we had about 5, down to 1, 1, 3, about 3. So as you can see, this water did not have many microplastics in it, whether we started out or we finished up. That's a good thing. So it's difficult to say, how effective drinking water treatment is, but it's looking like it's pretty good. So coagulation and filtration, we know remove microplastics, and I would suggest we likely remove at least 70% through these mechanisms. What we don't know is oxidation. If we, expose the particle to ozone or chlorine, does this oxidize it or break it up? We don't have those answers, but we're looking at that. Also, in terms of distribution systems, do we see microplastics settling out in the distribution systems that give us lower numbers at the tap? We're currently doing studies at 15 treatment facilities across Canada to help answer these questions. People often ask, okay, what do you think is the best type of water treatment to remove these small particles? And I would say likely ultrafiltration from the types of treatment that we currently use. So this would be like passing the water through a very thin membrane. So we looked at 2 water treatment facilities that employ this technology. And we have different types of treatment before, and then we have ultrafiltration. So what do the results look like? Here's the first treatment facility that we looked at. So you can see what's going into the ultrafilter. So maybe about 7 or 8 particles. And then coming out, we're here less than 1. And what we did is we have to filter a lot of water. And typically in our studies, we'll filter anything from 100 to 1,000 liters of water and then search through that to try and find these particles that are there with everything else that's present in water. What we saw was removal of at least 95% of the 13 types of plastics that we looked at. So let's look at another treatment facility in Ontario. This one again employs ultrafiltration. And at first glance, you say, pretty similar results. And you'd be right. We saw about 94, 95% removal. But I have to say there was a but. Let's look over at this y-axis. This is about an order of magnitude or 10 times lower than the other facility. So we had lower amounts in the surface water. They may have been removed to a better extent, so that after treatment, when we look at the effluent, we're down to much less than 1/10 of 1 particle in a liter of water. So this is looking like some pretty good news for us. And this we've published in 2022 in Chemosphere. Okay, what's coming? So we know that we're not going to have 0 microplastics in water. Probably not going to happen, in the next decade or 2. So what are we going to do about it? What's our approach? And I have to give a lot of credit to the state of California at being the first to seriously take a look at this in terms of potential future regulations. And this just came recently. They came up with a definition for microplastics last year in 2021. And then what we took part of is many other labs in the world was to compare analysis methods that we could use to detect these. So where are they going in terms of future legislation? Well, first of all, adopt a standard methodology for testing. Yeah, and we did that very well by working with about 17 labs cooperatively in the last year. Now what they're going to be starting next year is monitoring for 4 years at selective treatment facilities in California to determine how many microplastics are in the lakes, the rivers, and ultimately in the treated water. After that time, also as the science progresses, hopefully 4 years from now, they will be able to say, should we have a notification level or a guidance such that we can say, should we be regulating these or not? So again, the science needs to catch up with the monitoring, or actually it goes hand in hand. So what are we doing about this? Well, currently we're in studies that are examining 15 drinking water treatment plants coast to coast in Canada. And that's going to give us a lot more insight. As I previously mentioned, we're looking at non-target analysis to see what compounds or chemicals these plastics sorb. We're looking at, perfluorinated compounds because these are very much in the news and they have recently been regulated in drinking waters. Also, we're looking at the use of point of use devices. This is not anything that I would necessarily recommend, but people that have these on their home are going to want to know, do these also take out microplastics? And we should be publishing a paper on that fairly soon. We're also looking at, what does disinfection in treatment facilities do with respect to microplastics, and how much leaching and what is the toxicity of compounds that can leach out of microplastics. So we've got a lot of on the go. We have one of the biggest microplastic research groups literally in North America at this time. And we've just recently submitted a paper regarding the toxicity of chemical additives that may then leach out of different types of plastics. And this was a great collaborative study between engineering and the Department of Chemistry at U of T. So there's a couple major funding bodies that I have to acknowledge: Natural Science and Engineering Research Council, and as well, Environment and Climate Change actually has an initiative just on increasing knowledge on plastic pollution and all the other impacts. Also, we are funded very nicely by a range of some of the largest water treatment facilities in Ontario, and we could not do this work without their collaboration. And actually, that brings me to the end. So hopefully you know a bit more than you did a half an hour ago. Hopefully now when someone asks you, should I be concerned? You can say, well, I'm not sure yet, but we're gaining information and we're getting there, and I understand it a bit better than I did before.
Thank you, Bob. We have a lot of questions submitted online, so I won't have to revert to those submitted prior to today's Lunch and Learn. The first is from David Paris, who says, I am a 72-year-old male, having lived 52 years in Southern Ontario. 2 questions. How much microplastics is in my body, and is it concentrated in specific organs? And what would be the forecast for my 3-month grandson? So both ends of the age spectrum.
Well, I guess what I would say right now is I would say not to worry, because we don't have any hard evidence to say that these are going to be deleterious to the human body. We just don't know. And that's why we're looking at this now. I can say quite freely that Ontario lakes and our source waters have some of the lowest microplastic numbers that we've seen. And from the treated drinking waters that we've seen, the numbers are very low as well. So I would be more concerned about other things like, eating right, getting enough exercise, and I wouldn't be concerned about this until such time that we have more information.
Thank you. The next question is from Doug Hooton. What is the major source of the plastics, I guess he means microplastics, in the oceans?
Well, a lot of the sources from microplastics come literally from wastewater discharges. Wastewater treatment facilities were never designed to remove these very, very, very small particles. So those combined with all of the other trash that you see entering the ocean, as we've seen pictures of bottles and other types of plastics. But in terms of our freshwaters around the globe, I think it's well known that wastewater presents a lot of the plastics.
Thank you. The next question is from Cecil King. And you touched on this early in your presentation. Why does bottled water have more microplastics than ordinary tap water?
It's a good question, and we haven't done those studies, so I'm just quoting work by others. But what it appears is that these occur during the manufacturing of the process. And for example, when they're milling the surface of where they attach the cap and actually attaching the cap itself, is it fragments, particles. This is what I have come to learn.
I'm glad I've been drinking Toronto tap water rather than bottled water during your presentation. Next question from Jeff Assel. How do these compare to the action of asbestos particles, which at one time was a serious health concern?
That's a good question, and I'm actually, I can't give you a direct answer to that, so I'm going to pass it on to Sue, and she probably can't either, but between the two of us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the main thing, though, there is actually a good comparison there, in that asbestos particles, when they're inhaled into the lungs, they irritate the membranes of the cells in the lungs, and I think they can pass through those membranes as well, if I'm not mistaken. So the same thing happens with microplastics, the very, very tiny ones, even the nanoplastics, if you will. They can, when you ingest them, translocate into the different organs in the similar sort of way.
Thank you. The next question is from Vincent. Are there studies that show whether using other materials such as metals, aluminum, for example, or glass significantly improve the situation and reduce the finding of microplastics or other additives?
Yeah, I've never seen anything like that, because I guess we would have to assume that everything that our food comes in contact with, plastic packaging, would be replaced by metal or glass. And I just can't comment on that.
I mean, some food obviously is delivered in cans or in glass bottles, but you're right, perhaps not everything could be transitioned to such packaging. The next question is from Marv. Why are these microplastics not broken down by stomach acids when they are ingested?
That's a good one, and I can't give you a definitive answer. I'm going to pass that on to Sue as well.
Well, I'm glad. Here we go.
I can only say that a chemical engineer rather than a civil engineer would answer it better, except to say that these polymers are designed specifically to be resistant to strong acids and strong bases. So not being dissolved in the stomach acids is doing exactly what they were designed to do, or not to do.
So you're saying the nature of these polymers is such that they are inherently acid resistant?
Absolutely.
Okay. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. Is ingestion of water a major route of human exposure to microplastics compared to our exposure to microplastics in food? So water versus food.
Yeah, I'll start on that one. That's an excellent question. Other people have looked at that, and I think what we've found is that water may represent about 20% of our exposure. So, we can be exposed through food as well as through air. For example, tire rubber, if you live close to a highway, or there's a lot of particulates in the atmosphere. So, I mean, the numbers I've heard are around 20% may come from water. So it's a smaller portion compared to other routes of exposure.
But not insignificant.
No.
Sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Sorry, I was just going to add, it's not insignificant. It's not the major exposure route, but it's not to be ignored either.
Thank you. The next question comes from Richard Gabby, who asks, have you assessed the results of sampling drinking water at the treatment facility and water delivered to the consumer through PVC pipes?
Yeah, and we're actually doing that now, and with a specific focus on PVC. We don't think to date that we're going to be seeing PVC particles, but what we're more concerned of is when we're using plastic pipe, are we going to see any chemicals that are leaching from the pipe? And we currently have one MASC student who that is her life these days, trying to see if chemicals leach from PVC under conditions similar to drinking water.
That prompts a somewhat related question. In our neighborhood, some of the water mains have recently been replaced by plastic pipes. Are those typically PVC or are they some other polymer?
They're typically PVC. It's most widely used in water pipe replacement.
Okay, so that's an important question that Richard asked. The next one comes from another anonymous attendee. When microplastics are filtered out of water, don't they just end up in the filtered solids? Do the methods for disposing of or treating those solids destroy the microplastics, or will they just end up going back into the environment?
And that's a very good question. You know, most of the things that we take out of drinking water likely end up in landfills. So, you know, we're taking from one place and putting them in another. I don't know, Sue, do you want to comment on that?
No, that's basically it. I mean, for any kind of material you can capture as a solid, if you can't, say, use it for energy by burning it, you would basically landfill it. So hopefully the landfills are secure.
Thank you. The next question comes from somebody on the West Coast named David. Is the water treatment plant in Whistler one of your studies? For years, their water has been highly rated.
I can say quite honestly, we haven't looked at the Whistler plant. We are in touch with plants in BC, but that is not one of them.
So you have not rated it. Somebody else has given it a high rating.
I've heard that the water is good. I've been in Whistler. It tastes good to me. So, but I can't say much beyond that.
So you have drunk Whistler water?
Yes.
The next question is again from Cecil King. Can you recap the triple threat? Chemical vector delivery, biofilm, what's the third?
The third is just the size of the particle itself, the size and the chemical composition, but primarily the physical size of the particle, in that the smaller particles can, you know, stay in the body, they're not readily broken down and can move through the body.
Next question is from Tom Latta. Have any studies been done on RO membrane performance, whatever RO stands for microplastics removal and the impact of microplastics on RO membrane fouling and clean in place requirements?
I'm not sure if anybody has looked specifically at reverse osmosis. I have to assume that they have, but I would assume that it would likely be 100% barrier to microplastics. I don't know, Sue, if you've seen anything on that.
No, I haven't seen anything specific on that. No, but the RO membranes have the smallest pore size, so they would be the ones that would be removing the most amount of microplastics.
You know, we've looked at ultrafiltration, which is, you know, the pore size on that is 0.02 microns. And, you know, that's being used in drinking water facilities in Ontario right now. And we're finding it actually works quite well.
Next question is from Farhim Ahmed. Thank you for the presentation. As a materials engineering graduate that is aware of so many uses of plastics, I found it very insightful. I have a question. Where do you see the field of plastics engineering heading With microplastics, will we have to reduce the additives we put in plastics or eliminate them altogether? Oh my God.
I think we have to let the science catch up with it. You have to remember where we are on microplastics. It was, within the last 5 years that we've been aware that there's microplastics, in food, in water. So now the toxicology and the science has to catch up with the occurrence data. And we're just not there yet. There are no regulations in North America with respect to microplastics in drinking water because there's nothing to date that says they're harmful. But no one's looked at it from that perspective. That's why we're doing the work we're doing now.
Thank you. Next question is from Ursula, who asks, and this is related to PVC pipes. When analyzing PVC pipe absorption contamination with microplastics, is the age of PVC pipes considered as a factor in the absorption of microplastics?
Excellent question. And we would assume that it would be. And it's not that, the PVC pipe is absorbing microplastics. The PVC could be absorbing chemicals from the water, but, it would likely not matter because there's no harmful chemicals left in our water that's put into our distribution systems. We have very stringent requirements in terms of what treated drinking water can contain. It would be, does something leach from PVC pipe over time? And that's exactly what we're looking at right now.
Thank you. The next question, and probably the last, is again from Farhim Ahmed. Are fibers, particles from clothes coming loose in the laundry a concern? What portion is this of the average human's exposure to microplastics? Do you believe that we should stop using synthetic fibers in our clothing, curtains, and bedding? Many of the questions submitted in advance, some people did ask about filters on their washing machines and so on. Are they effective? And if so, what is the best type?
Okay, first of all, when we talk about microplastics, a lot of what we see is indeed fibers. So that's an excellent question. We see more fibers than we do fragments typically. And we assume that these come from clothes, probably like much of us are wearing today. When they're washed, the water goes into wastewater treatment facilities, but it hasn't been designed to remove these. So people, if they wish, can put filters on their laundry equipment. And there have been studies that have evaluated those. I don't know which ones to recommend because that's not our specific area. But fibers are a big part of this issue. And the question is, how do we deal with it? Do we change the content of our fabrics, or do we remove them better, in wastewater treatment? So this is a very big question, but I'm glad that somebody brought up fibers.
And with that, we are at the top of the hour, just past the top of the hour. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, everybody in the audience. There were a lot of online questions, which is quite surprising and very encouraging as well from our audience today. Before we close, I would like to thank both Professor Robert Andrews for his presentation and Susan Andrews for her answers and her aid in answering some of the questions. Thank you for such an informative and entertaining presentation on microplastics in drinking water. It is obviously a very topical subject. To everyone who joined us here today, we invite you to share your feedback on the Skule Lunch and Learn series. A link to our online survey is being made available in the chat at the bottom of your screen and will also be shared with all of you after this event. Also, a link to the presentation will be also shared with all registered guests early next week, so you can view the presentation again. In closing, the Skule Lunch and Learn events are traditionally hosted on the second Wednesday of each month. Our next Lunch and Learn event will be on Wednesday, March 9th. However, this specific Lunch and Learn event will be quite different from our traditional presentations. This event will showcase the innovative and progressive research currently underway at the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering from three remarkable professors, Professors David Sinton, Elham Marzi, and Timothy Chan, two of whom have spoken to Lunch and Learn in the past. With professors from three different departments sharing their work, this event will be an exciting display of the research expertise that helps to make U of T the top-ranking engineering school in Canada. For more information about our next Lunch and Learn presentation, please visit the engineering website. In closing, I would also like to acknowledge and thank TD Insurance and Manulife, both of whom are sponsors of Skule Lunch and Learn through U of T's Pillar Sponsorship Program. If you are interested in learning more about Skule Lunch and Learn, please contact the alumni office at events@engineering.utoronto.ca. In closing, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for today's presentation. I hereby adjourn today's session of Skule Lunch and Learn. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing each of you again next month. Thank you and goodbye.